Look, no one aside from drunk taxi drivers is willing to call this one. It's almost impossible to get anyone to commit. I did get one of the savviest journalists I know over there to say he's leaning towards Serangoon Whips, the incumbent, winning the election, but it's really too close to call. And it's going to probably be a week or so before we know who's won because there's a big Palau diaspora in the US and they have to wait for those votes to come in.
Of course, you were in Palau not that long ago. What was the sense on the ground when you were there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting election because, if either of these guys ran against anyone else, they would win. They've run against each other before in 2016. In that case, Remengensau, who was the incumbent then, won the election, but by a really narrow margin. And both the candidates are, I guess, fairly well liked. They're popular, they're charismatic. The main differences really are on tax policy, which sounds extremely dull, but that is mostly what the election is being fought on. They have very different visions of taxation. So rather than not talking about tax, which is what happens in Australia, that's kind of all they've been talking about, that and the cost of living.
As they say, it is the economy, but also, what is playing out is this sort of battle for influence between China and the United States. We know that Serangoon Whips Jr. is very much in favor of relations with the U.S. His opponent, Tommy Remengensau, he's not completely on one side or the other, but does see a scope for more cooperation with China. So do you see any significant shift towards closer engagement with China should Tommy Remengensau win?
Look, there'll definitely be more openness to engagement if Remengensau wins. It would be difficult to find any politician on the planet, even including the US, that was more pro-US than Whips. He spouts Reagan doctrine. He quotes Ronald Reagan. He literally wraps himself in the American flag. Remengensau is probably more a middle-of-the-road Pacific politician. He's fond of saying things like friends to all, enemies to none, which is something you hear across the Pacific. But he's a long, long way from being a pro-Beijing candidate. He's just a guy who sees the benefit of a bit of hedging and a bit of balancing.
And how focused do you think Beijing and Washington are when it comes to the outcome of this election in Palau?
Look, I think they're very focused. There's a lot of nerviness on the ground that, if Beijing is trying to influence this election in some ways, both the outcome and whoever wins, they're doing their best to shape the makeup, not of the presidential election, but there's also a Senate race and a sort of a congressional delegates race as well. So there's a feeling that if enough of these guys get won over to China's side by various means, by inducements, by promises of development, by promises of tourism projects, then that could lead in the future to a more pro-Beijing candidate putting his hand up. Because realistically, Remengensau, if he loses, probably won't run again. And that leaves the field open to another candidate that we don't yet know about.
Of course,
That'll
also
be 4 years from now, though.
Yes, of course. Now, also in the background is the fact that Palau is one of very few countries that diplomatically recognize Taiwan. How do you see that playing out in the next few years? Would Palau continue to maintain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the closest country to China out of all of Taiwan's allies, so it is a really significant one both for Taiwan and for the US. In a lot of Taiwan's allies, you get the feeling that they haven't sent their best people there, but you don't get that vibe in Palau. They've got extremely serious people on the ground. They're really engaged. They keep their finger on the pulse. And they do provide a lot of aid. A lot of students study in Taiwan. There's even a significant Taiwanese diaspora in electoral terms. So it is a country that Taiwan is paying a lot of attention to because they don't want to lose an ally so close to, but it's also the closest ally to them. So they certainly don't want to lose their closest ally in a geographical sense.
Of course, the mind of Palauans on this, on the Compact of Free Association with the U.S., and I have to just talk about this to the audience, is that Washington funds 10% of Palau's budget while retaining full control of defense and military operations. Do you think any leader who gets to power will be even looking at changing that at all? And is that something that the public in Palau is hoping to see altered in some way or form?
Look, it's very unlikely. I mean, Whips has negotiated an extremely strong deal, and that's a big part of his presidential pitch. And this deal runs for another 20 years. So essentially, they're getting almost $1 billion over 20 years in support. In exchange, they can serve in the US military, and they serve in the US military at a higher rate than anywhere in America, anywhere in the world. There's an incredible number of Palauans in the US military. It also allows them to access Social Security, and as of fairly recently, it allows them to enroll in a publicly funded college in the US. So they have almost the same rights as Americans. So it's so popular. It's really unlikely anyone in Palau would win by saying, yeah, let's get rid of the compact and go in with China, because they are the most successful compact state. They're the richest country in the Pacific, and they've done really well with what they've been given.
Yep, and on the reverse side, Graeme, how are Palauans viewing elections in the US with polls already opening in some states?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's a country that's been raised on the voice of America. I mean, people are generally very pro-US in a way that as an Australian you find almost unnerving. Like, you know, they're sort of spouting things you don't expect to hear outside of the United States. So I'd say, I mean, it's hard to say whether people lean towards Trump, but they're certainly watching very closely, because the future of Palau is very much tied to the future of the United States. They've got diaspora that numbers in the thousands, and if the American economy tanks, and there's a feeling that America will pay less attention to Palau, then yeah, that does affect the country. So, but it is by far one of the most pro-US places you'll find on the planet.
Okay, Graeme Smith, really good to get your analysis. Love that shirt. Thanks very much.
Thank you. See ya.